Very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I just want to begin by saying that I'm not a math educator. I'm a psychologist by training and a developmental cognitive neuroscientist. So what I will share with you is very much from the point of view of somebody who takes sort of a scientific lens to these things, but I do interact frequently with educators and take educators' input into account when we think about math learning difficulties. So I guess for this session what I'm going to be talking about is how do we understand and assess for developmental dyscalculia. So just to give you a bit of an outline of what I intend to cover this morning, I'll start with some definitions and diagnostic criteria for developmental dyscalculia. Then I'll talk about what do we know, but also importantly what we don't know, because there's a lot that we don't know about the symptoms and causes of developmental dyscalculia. And I'll do this by reviewing evidence from behavioral research, as well as a little bit of neuroscience and a little bit of genetics. But the genetics and the neuroscience is very much at the conceptual level. Just what can we actually gain from looking at the brain? What can we gain from looking at our biology in terms of understanding what's in front of us in terms of children who have math difficulties? And then if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about mathematics anxiety and how it is different from developmental dyscalculia, because there's, I think, important distinctions between sort of a persistent math learning difficulty and a strong emotional reaction and avoidance of math. Those two things turn out to be quite different, and I think that informs practice in important ways. So many of you will be aware that there's been tremendous progress in understanding reading and reading difficulties, developmental dyslexia. Whilst we're making progress in the field of developmental dyscalculia, we're very much behind. So this is statistics from 2007 suggesting that for every 14 publications on developmental dyslexia, there was one publication on developmental dyscalculia. I'm afraid to say that since 2007, the state of affairs has not improved dramatically. So we're still having this unequal sort of knowledge, foundation, if you like, for developmental dyscalculia compared to developmental dyslexia. Having said that, we have made some progress, and I hope to share some of the progress with you, as well as also what we don't know. So let's look at, first of all, how do we go about defining developmental dyscalculia? Well, probably the best place to look are classification schemes, and this is the most commonly used one, the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association. And this is in its 5th edition. And in the DSM-5, dyscalculia, or mathematics learning disorder, falls under the category of specific learning disorder. So it says here, and I won't be able to read the full quote because I've got the captions in the way, but I'll try my best to sort of recreate this. It's defined as a neurodevelopmental disorder of biological origin, manifested in learning difficulty and problems in acquiring academic skills, markedly below age level, and manifested in the early school years, lasting for at least 6 months, not attributed to intellectual disorder, other developmental disorder, or sensory motor disorders. So it makes a very specific definition here of a deficit that is very specific to a particular domain of learning. And there's a couple of things to highlight here. It says that it's of biological origin, and I just want you to bear that in mind, because we'll talk a little bit about the underlying neurobiology, we'll talk a little bit about the genetics of developmental dyscalculia. And one really critical thing, I think this is really important, and I'm so glad that this is formalized in the definition, is that it should last for at least 6 months, because all of you in this room who are working with children will know that, especially for young children, they can appear as though they have a difficulty, but 6 months later they're completely fine, right? That's because we have highly variable developmental trajectories in our classrooms, and each child has a slightly different developmental trajectory. Therefore, it is important when we try to arrive at an assessment that somebody has a severe learning difficulty, that this is a persistent difficulty, something that we can repeatedly measure rather than just some transitory state of development. I think this is really critical. And then within the DSM-5, what you have to specify for specific learning disorder is if it's a disorder with impairments in reading, would be dyslexia, written expression dyspraxia, and with an impairment in mathematics, it would be dyscalculia or mathematics learning difficulties. And then it further says, you know, there's difficulties with number sense, fact and calculation, as well as mathematical reasoning. So that gives us some definition of what developmental dyscalculia is. Is there any way I can move these captions just down just a little bit? Because otherwise I can't really... yeah, absolutely. You may, yes.
I don't even see the cursor.
You know what? I'm going to survive. It's fine. Just... okay. No, this is...
there you go.
that will be better, yes.
Okay.
Wonderful. Now I seem to have lost my... oh boy. Here we go. But now it's back. It's back to the prior state of affairs. So if we go stop share, go zoom. Sorry about this. Here we are. It's not going to work. It's, you know, computer says no. So it's okay. Don't worry about it. I'll survive. So that's the disorder. That's sort of the definition that is formalized within the DSM-5. So what about prevalence? How frequently do we encounter developmental dyscalculia? Well, prevalence estimates suggest that the population prevalence is between 5 and 7%. I would take these prevalence estimate with a grain of salt because these studies are rather old, and I think we do need more prospective longitudinal studies to fully understand the prevalence of developmental dyscalculia. But what we can say is that the prevalence is comparable to that of developmental dyslexia. And of course, there are other names. I realize that, you know, having lived in North America now for 17 years, that developmental dyscalculia is not something that is commonly used in either Canada, where I live, or in the United States. So there are other names, such as mathematics learning disorder. And in the previous iteration of the DSM, the DSM-4, it was called mathematics disorder. So these are essentially interchangeable terms. So there's nothing different about developmental dyscalculia compared to what some people might refer to as mathematics learning disorder or mathematics disorder. Now, how do we go about diagnosing developmental dyscalculia? Well, oftentimes what school psychologists will do is to use some kind of cutoff score. So you will say, for example, that if you have a test of mathematical ability that has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15, you might say, well, I need children to be at least 1.5 standard deviation below the mean for them to be assigned the label developmental dyscalculia. Or you might use a percentile rank. So you might say all children who are below the 10th percentile on a comprehensive battery of mathematical tests will be assigned the label developmental dyscalculia. Of course, this is ideally supplemented by clinical data, so by teacher observation, by school psychologists actually working with children to not only use the standardized tests, but also use their qualitative assessment and their expertise to determine whether a child really has persistent math learning difficulties. One really important thing to highlight is that developmental dyscalculia is often not isolated. I have met a few students during my career researching developmental dyscalculia that have a very isolated math learning difficulty, but most students present with other learning challenges, such as developmental dyslexia or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. While there is so much sort of co-occurrence of these learning difficulties, at present we do not yet understand what might be a common cause, if there is indeed a common cause. That is yet to be determined. Researchers haven't yet found a common cause. That doesn't mean that there is one. Of course, it would be extremely exciting if we were able to find a common cause that we could then, through teaching and remediation strategies address, because that would of course have downstream effects not just for math, but for the other learning difficulties that are affected. But we are not at this point yet. It is also entirely possible, of course, that these are simply learning difficulties that occur within the same child for different reasons, each having their independent cause. That's something that's yet to be fully understood. Developmental dyscalculia is often diagnosed, unfortunately I should say, using an IQ achievement discrepancy criterion. And if this is something that is the case in where you work, I think it's a problem that needs to be addressed, because the way that IQ achievement discrepancy diagnosis works, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is the notion that you test children's intelligence using a standardized intelligence test. You also test their math ability, and you will only diagnose those children with a math learning difficulty if their math scores are significantly below what their IQ is. Now, this is highly problematic because it excludes many students with difficulties, students who have both relatively low performance on an IQ test and have low performance on the standardized test of mathematics. It also ignores the potential effects of low achievement on IQ. So if you have a learning difficulty, you are less likely to be engaged by school, you're less likely to want to learn, and you're less likely to want to attend. And that is, of course, going to have an effect on how well you do on any kind of test, be that IQ or mathematics. And it is not inclusive. And it contributes as well to this wait to fail approach, where we wait until grade 3 or 4 to assess children for their learning difficulties. And there's lots of research actually to suggest that this kind of IQ achievement discrepancy criteria doesn't make a difference. The children look the same on their mathematical performance, whether they have been diagnosed with an IQ achievement discrepancy criteria or not. Let me illustrate this to you by reviewing this research article here by a group from the University of KU Leuven in Belgium. And what they did is they had 3 groups of children. They had a group of children with mathematics difficulties who were non-discrepant. That's the MD-ND group. And as you can see from the table, they've got low IQ and they've got low math. Then there's an MDD, that's an MD discrepant group. They've got both relatively good IQ, close to 100, and high math scores. And then there's a chronologically age-matched control group. Those are children who have both IQ and math ability within the normal range. So the critical question is, if discrepancy makes a difference to what kind of children you're presented with, then the MD-ND and the MDD group should look different from one another. Well, here's the data. This is looking at how children compare which of 2 numbers is larger and which of 2 dotted arrays is larger. And what I want you to pay attention to are the 2 gray bars. The slightly darker gray bar is the MD non-discrepant children. So these are children whose IQ and math align quite well. And then there's the MDD, where IQ and math ability are different from one another. The critical take-home here is that they look identical, right? The light gray and the dark gray bar, they're not statistically significantly different from one another. Yet both of them are much slower than the chronologically age-matched control group. That means the level of math difficulty that children experience, either with a low or high IQ, is equivalent. So we don't need to take intelligence into account when assessing for these specific learning difficulties such as developmental dyscalculia. And in fact, this is true for developmental dyslexia as well. This is a beautiful article published some years ago now by Tanaka out of Fumiko's Höft's group. And what they did is they looked at discrepant and non-discrepant dyslexic children. So children who had either IQ within the normal range or low IQ. And what they found was that when you looked at brain areas that were involved in phonological processing, that regardless of the level of IQ, children who had reading difficulties showed underactivation of those areas compared to children without reading difficulties, suggesting that really an IQ achievement discrepancy criteria does not make sense because it doesn't affect the severity of the difficulty that children experience. So it's best to be inclusive and consider all children who have mathematical learning difficulties. Of course, I think I'm preaching to the choir here about response to intervention or multi-tiered system supports, which I think is an outgrow, as far as I understand, of response to intervention. But this was essentially developed as an alternative to IQ achievement discrepancy criteria, and also in response to labels such as learning disability, to look at things in a more dynamic fashion. And there's this beautiful article by Douglas Fuchs and Lynn Fuchs, which is called Introduction to RTI, What, Why, and How Valid Is It? And in which they say that response to intervention integrates assessment and intervention within a multi-level prevention system to maximize student achievement and to reduce behavioral problems. With RTI, school use data to identify students at risk for poor learning outcomes, monitor student progress, provide evidence-based interventions, and adjust the intensity and nature of those interventions depending on a student's responsiveness, and identify students with learning disabilities or other disabilities. So, as you know, RTI works on this idea of tiers of instruction, where you've got at the lowest tier, tier 1, you've got the high quality core instruction that meets most students, and then those students are pulled out depending on their progress and assigned to tier 2, or if even tier 2 fails, they're assigned to tier 3, but they can, of course, jump between these levels either up or down. So this is a much different way to identifying students who have difficulties, rather than using, the route of referral to school psychologist. It is within a system that these students are supported, and it is really the degree to which they respond to instruction that counts, rather than any kind of standardized test. So I think that's a really good alternative to the standardized model of diagnosis. And I will highlight this as well because I'm going to refer to some other issues that have been reported when it comes to the diagnosis and definition of developmental dyscalculia. One of the real issues with developmental dyscalculia is that we don't have an independent marker. So you can't take a test and say, I've got developmental dyscalculia. That's impossible. Later on, I'll talk about genetics, which makes us even less optimistic that there'll be a biomarker. So that means we have to use arbitrary cutoff criteria to determine who is somebody with and without developmental dyscalculia. The other issue is that we do not know how early we can identify developmental dyscalculia with confidence. Everybody is shouting about early screening, and I agree, early screening is really important. But we also have to acknowledge that when we assess children in the early years, especially in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, there's a lot of variability, and therefore we can get a lot of high false positive rate. That means we can identify a lot of children as having a potential learning difficulty that is actually very transitory in nature and will go away within a few months. This is the experience from dyslexia, the experience from developmental language disorder. This is pretty universal observation. So early identification is extremely difficult. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do early screening. We must. But we mustn't assume that children are already in a steady state, but rather they're highly dynamic in the way in which they develop. And some children who look like they might have a difficulty one day, 6 months later, they'll be absolutely fine. The other problem that we have is that cutoff criteria used by researchers, used by school psychologists, vary substantially. This is a figure that my former postdoc Lean Peters and I put together some years ago for a paper in which we just wanted to illustrate that when we look at the literature on developmental dyscalculia, researchers use highly variable inclusion criterion. So this is a normal distribution with a mean of 0, and then you see the standard deviations to the left or to the right. And if you look at this, if you look at the left area, those shaded areas are different inclusion criterion. So what you can see is that some researchers are happy if children are just half a standard deviation, 1 standard deviation below the mean, they assign the label developmental dyscalculia. And others require 2.5 or even 3 standard deviations below the mean to assign that label. So we have a real problem because we are putting together data from different studies that have vastly different inclusion criteria. So this is something that research needs to fix. But let's say we had some kind of magical agreement among school psychologists, among researchers, about what is the cutoff point for developmental dyscalculia. And let's say we said it is 85. So this again is a standardized score with a mean of 100, standard deviation of 15, and let's say we will include all children under the umbrella of math learning difficulty or developmental dyscalculia if they have a standard score of 85 or below. So that's what we will do. Well, even if we do that, we cannot then go away and say that these children are qualitatively different from those who are above that mean. It doesn't mean that their brains work differently. It just means that we have selected a proportion of the population that we believe needs additional attention. That's all it means. We cannot infer from it that these are different learners or that they require a completely different type of instruction. We've just set an arbitrary cutoff point. Because I think sometimes the label developmental dyscalculia suggests that these children are in a way qualitatively different from children who do not have that label, but it is the lower distribution of the normal distribution. It is not some kind of a biological test that tells us that there's something fundamentally different. And this is not a new issue. This is an issue that has been highlighted time and time again. This is a wonderful perspective published by the International Dyslexia Association by Linda Siegel, who says that there are many complex issues to consider in developing an appropriate definition of dyslexia. One of the major problems is that there's no specific blood test or brain imaging result that can provide a diagnosis. Fundamentally, the issue is that reading, you can exchange that for math, is measured on a continuum, and there's no cutoff point that clearly divides individuals into different groups. The distinction between dyslexia and normal reading is arbitrary. Where the cutoff point is drawn varies from study to study. I think this is really important to bear in mind, that we're dealing with pragmatic decisions around where we set the cutoff point rather than some independent criteria. And in fact, the DSM-5 that provides the definition that I offered to you at the beginning of my presentation of specific learning difficulties with mathematics, they themselves, although they provide a categorical diagnostic scheme, classification scheme, they themselves admit that academic skills are distributed along a continuum, so there's no natural cut point that can be used to differentiate individuals with and without specific learning disorder. Thus, any threshold used to specify what constitutes significantly low achievement is to a large extent arbitrary. So this is essentially a summary of what I've just told you, which is that the cutoff points are arbitrary, and I think that's very important to bear in mind when considering what developmental dyscalculia is. So that's all I want to say about diagnosis and about definitions of developmental dyscalculia. I now want to dive into what do we know about the symptoms and causes of developmental dyscalculia. And I also want to re-emphasize that I'm also going to be telling you about what we don't know, because there's a lot that we don't know. So one of the things that we can be sure of is that children who have math learning difficulties will present with difficulties in retrieving arithmetic facts from memory. This is something that I've observed in all of the children that we have worked with in my laboratory. It's striking that children who have math learning difficulties cannot retrieve the solution to simple problems such as 3 plus 5 from long-term memory. Instead, they persist in using rather immature problem-solving strategies, such as counting on their fingers. We know from a lot of developmental research that when children learn to calculate, they first use their fingers, and fingers are incredibly important tools for children in early mathematics. And we also know that children grow in their sophistication of arithmetic strategies gradually over time. So initially, Sarah might solve 3 plus 2 by going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Later, Sarah discovers that she can just hold 3 up and add 2. That's an additional mental leap in strategy development. children who have math learning difficulties do not undergo that progression where they are, increasingly developing more and more efficient and sophisticated arithmetic strategies. Rather, they are arrested at the most basic level of strategy use. This is something we know, especially from the pioneering work of David Geary from the University of Missouri, who did a lot of the early work on math learning difficulties and was really a pioneer in this field. But when we think about all of this put together, this is a model from 1993, we can see that children with developmental dyscalculia have real difficulties with fact retrieval. And according to David Geary, these difficulties with fact retrieval have to do with working memory difficulties, the ability to hold information online. When you are calculating, you need to carry, you need to borrow, you need to hold some operands online while you do a different operation. And if that is compromised, then you're going to have difficulties with fact retrieval. Also, other things such as counting knowledge and your counting speed play into this, according to David Geary's model. And what he proposed is that there is a number of functional deficits as well as potential deficits in supporting systems. So, as I've already said to you, children with developmental dyscalculia are typically found to use immature counting procedures to solve simple arithmetic problems. And this is probably because they are starting out with an immature conceptual understanding of counting. So this is already the kinds of foundations that are laid in kindergarten when we teach children the counting principles, right? When we teach them that counting allows you to determine the total number of items in a set. When we teach them that the number sequence is ordered, when we teach them how to skip count, that's all laying the foundations for their later arithmetic development. That they frequently engage in counting procedures errors, and that this is driven by immature conceptual understanding of counting and poor working memory, and that they have these arithmetic fact retrieval deficits. So a persistent inability to retrieve arithmetic facts from memory is a hallmark of developmental dyscalculia. And when you see students who are really not able, despite your best efforts, to reach a level where they at least, all of us will use counting procedures at some point in our daily lives, depending on the difficulty of the problem. But if simple arithmetic problems just don't make their way over the repeated practice and instruction into long-term memory, that's probably a sign that a child might be struggling with just very basic understanding of math. But this begs the question, what happens earlier in development, and what about factors that are specific to number processing? If we talk about things such as working memory, we need working memory for everything. We needed working memory when we got up this morning and had to think about which session to go, where it was, whilst we also had to get ourselves ready and so forth. So working memory is ubiquitous in our everyday lives. But there are some things that are specific to math. And so researchers have really been trying to understand, well, what might be going on in dyscalculia that is a little bit like what's going on in developmental dyslexia, where you've got, a difficulty in understanding speech sounds and mapping speech sounds to letters. Could something similar, something more domain-specific be going on in developmental dyscalculia? Could there be a core deficit? And here, researchers have been focusing a lot on how we and other species process sets in the world around us, like the number of chairs in this room or the number of people in this room. I can very quickly look at this and come up with some estimate. I'm not going to embarrass myself and come up with an estimate that's way off. But it's been found that even very young babies are able to discriminate between sets. So if you show a 6-month-old baby an array of 16 dots, a lot of times, eventually they get bored and they look away. And then you present them with an array of 8 dots, they actually get interested in that because they notice there's been a difference in the number of items in the display. And we also know that we share this basic sensitivity to number with other species. So non-human primates have been shown to be able to discriminate between set sizes. And we also know from lots of brain imaging research as well as single-cell recording in awake behaving animals that areas in and around the intraparietal sulcus, which I'm highlighting here in yellow, kind of a bird's eye view of the brain, that these areas are sensitive to numerical quantities. So it seems that we're born with some kind of rudimentary intuitions around quantity and numerical sets and relationships between sets. And may that be what lies at the heart of math learning difficulties, that in essence, if you have a defective number sense, that is going to downstream over developmental time lead to math learning difficulties. A very appealing hypothesis. But in this realm, there have been two possible core deficits that have been proposed. One of them is that, yes, you're born with a defective, what might be called a number module, and then you're essentially doomed. What a terrible prospect, right? Or might it be instead that what you have difficulty with is not so much your intuitions around quantities, but it's your ability to connect the symbolic forms that are transmitted through culture. You know, number symbols are not something that animals have, right? It's not even universal across the planet. These are symbols that have been around for 6,000 years, 7,000 years, and we use them ubiquitously in our everyday lives, and we teach them to children. So might it be that some children really have difficulties grasping that connection between their intuitive number sense and this cultural symbolic layer that we provide them with through our instruction, be that informal as well as formal instruction? Well, let's look at the possibility of these two hypotheses. Let's first of all look at the first hypothesis, which looks at this notion that children might have an impaired number module, or what's called here an approximate number system. So in this study by Michel Mazzocco and colleagues, they used a longitudinal study where children had participated over 10 years, impressive longitudinal study. And children were at this point in grade 9. And looking back at their math scores, you could identify 4 groups of children. One group of children who had very persistent math difficulties and had demonstrated those over a period of, I think, 6 years. And they were in the 10th percentile or lower. Then you had a low achieving group that were between the 11th and 25th, a typically achieving group, as well as a high achieving group, which, by the way, is a group that I think we don't look at enough and should be looking at more at both ends of the distribution. But what they did is they just gave them a very simple number discrimination task. Tell me if there are more blue or more yellow dots. And these are flashed, I think, for less than a second. And the child has to make sort of intuitive judgment as to which quantity is larger, blue or yellow. And what you're seeing here, don't worry too much about what Weber fraction means. Just know that a higher bar means worse performance, worse numerical discrimination performance. And unfortunately, the labels are hidden. But the highest bar, they sort of go from left to right and from very low to high mathematical ability. And you can definitely see, right, that the low achieving students are performing worse than those who have, you know, somewhat low scores, and the best performing students are those that are the high achieving students. So this seems to tell us that perhaps, you know, mathematical learning difficulties, developmental dyscalculia is driven by this weakness in this system that we're essentially born with. However, I would say that these children were tested when they were in grade 9. So we don't know anything about their developmental trajectories, and we don't know anything about the interactions with the symbolic system. But this is definitely support for the notion of an impaired number module. But as it is in science, there's always you know, different results as well. So here is a study from the KU Leuven in Belgium, where what they showed was that actually it's more likely, that's what's going on here, is that children have difficulties in connecting symbolic representations with their pre-existing non-symbolic counterparts. So in this study, they tested 3 groups of children, one group with math learning difficulty, one low achieving group, and one typically achieving group. And they gave them tests of both non-symbolic as well as symbolic number discrimination. So judge which of 2 dot arrays is larger or which of 2 numerical symbols is larger. And what they found here, this is showing you how fast children were. If you look at the white bar, these are the children with math learning difficulties. The slightly lighter gray bar is the low achieving, and then the dark gray bar is the typically achieving. You can see that for symbolic, which you have to trust me because of the captions, the label is hidden, but the symbolic reaction times are on the left side of your display, and the non-symbolic on the right side of the display, and I did put those computer monitors on there so you can see that. You can see that there's only a difference between groups for the symbolic and not for non-symbolic. So this is evidence for this notion that the difficulty is not in the innate, inborn system for quantity discrimination, but rather in children's ability to link that pre-existing system with the symbolic system. So there's lots of conflicting findings. So what do we do? Some support both core deficit hypotheses, so we can't really say which of these hypotheses is correct. But one of the things we need to note is that this literature is full of studies that have really small sample sizes and have variable selection criteria, as I referred to you before. That, you know, that chart where you could see that some studies select students who are -3 standard deviations and some only -1 standard deviation. So there's really need for a large-scale study of developmental dyscalculia that includes multiple methods. And thankfully, just 2 years ago, a group at the University of Cambridge did exactly that. They took a group of 1,500 children with a very stringent cutoff criterion, 10th percentile, which ended up with just over 40 children with developmental dyscalculia, and they tested them on a wide variety of measures. Now, this next figure is very busy, so I will take you through this. This is just showing the results of the difference between children with and without math learning difficulty on a variety of measures. So you've got dot discrimination, you've got symbolic discrimination, you've got working memory, both verbal as well as spatial, and you see the standardized difference along the horizontal axis. And the little dotted line in the middle is the 0 point. That would indicate that the groups don't differ. And what you can see is, yes, the children with math learning difficulty differ from the children without math learning difficulty, but not in a highly specific way. There's not one problem that they have that really stands out. But there's multiple difficulties, including difficulties with processing symbols, as well as working memory. So this suggests that maybe we shouldn't spend more time trying to identify a single difficulty that underpins math learning difficulties, but appreciate that math learning difficulties come from many different causes, and many different learning challenges play into what then ends up being a math learning difficulty. But one of the things that stands out is that clearly children with developmental dyscalculia do have problems with some of the most fundamental number processing tasks. And I just want to show you one study that I think illustrates this quite beautifully. It's an old study, and in fact the first study that ever considered this hypothesis that children with developmental dyscalculia have basic number processing difficulties. This is by Landell, Bevan, and Butterworth from 2004. And what they had in this study was 4 different groups. So one group of children with developmental dyscalculia, so they had a math learning difficulty. Am I getting close to my time already, or how am I doing? 20 minutes, good, very good, very good. That's enough time. So they had 4 groups of children. They had one group of children with developmental dyscalculia, so math learning difficulty, a group of children with reading difficulties, as well as a group of children who had both math and reading difficulties, and a group of children without either math or reading difficulties. And they gave them this simple task here. What you can do in this task is either ask children to attend to the numerical quantity, so to say which of the 2 numbers is larger, or to ask them to attend to the physical size, right? Which one is physically larger. And that's of course really interesting, because if a child with developmental dyscalculia has difficulties just perceptually perceiving symbols, then they would do poorly both on the size comparison and on the quantity comparison. But if they have a very specific difficulty in understanding that number symbols are representations of numerical quantity, then they would be okay in the size comparison, but they would have real difficulties in the number comparison. So what did they find? What you can see here is the 4 groups. So on the most left-hand side of your screen is the control group, then it's the, I think it's the the dyslexia group, and then it's the dyslexia group, then it's the dyscalculia group, and then it's the dyscalculia dyslexia group. And just focus on the green bars for now. You can see that all 4 groups are equally fast. This is the size comparison. They don't look any different. When it comes to comparing which number is physically larger, all groups are the same. When you now ask children, okay, now don't focus on size, but focus on the numerical quantity, then we can see that 2 groups stand out, right? And it's the group of children with dyscalculia and the group of children with both dyscalculia and dyslexia. They are significantly slower. So these are the bluish bars, or the purple bluish bars. They are significantly slower than both the control group and the group of children with developmental dyslexia. And I think this beautifully illustrates that children with math difficulties really have difficulties in processing symbols and connecting symbols to quantities. So this finding suggests that dyscalculia is, at least in part, a deficit to represent and process numerical magnitude in a typical way, and that therefore, if we think about developmental dyscalculia, we can start early in development. If children lack an understanding of numerical magnitude, then that will lead, over the course of developmental time, to difficulties in learning numerical expressions and maintaining them in memory. And I just want to take one moment to unpack that a little bit more, because I think this is a really critical point. You know, sometimes we say, does a child have a working memory difficulty? Do they have a processing difficulty? When we take a developmental perspective, we see how these things are linked. Because if you have a difficulty early in development in understanding symbols and their meaning, then if you're asked to do calculation, you're putting those representations into your working memory. Now, if those representations are impoverished, it's going to take a lot more of your working memory to hold them, to manipulate them, to combine them, to do all sorts of things with those representations. So it all starts with a lack of understanding numerical magnitude, which translates over the course of learning and development and in schooling into working memory difficulties. So we need to do away with these distinctions that it's either or. We need to look at these things developmentally and how they intersect, and how children who start out with a poor understanding of numerical magnitude end up looking like they have working memory difficulties. But those working memory difficulties are driven by the quality of the initial representations that they developed in their minds and in their brains. Briefly talk about the brain, because so often we are told, you know, neuroscience has all the answers. If we just knew how the brain works, then we could solve everything. I don't want to say that it's false, but I want to put a little bit of a note of caution on how much we can infer from neuroscience. So one of the things that we definitely do know is that there are brain regions that are involved in calculation. We've known that since the early 1900s, when people were studying patients who had brain damage and associating that with functional deficits, and patients who have damage to the parietal lobes, they lose their ability to calculate. It's a symptom called acalculia. So that's undeniable. The early findings from developmental dyscalculia, which of course is very different, right? If you as an adult have a tragic accident and you have damage to your parietal cortex, that is very different from a developing organism that is constructing and shaping their brains over the course of learning and development. But the early findings from developmental dyscalculia, this is functional neuroimaging research, seem to suggest that when you put children with math learning difficulties into an fMRI scanner, and you give them a bunch of calculation problems, they activate their parietal cortex less. So that seemed to be the suggestion that maybe they have this one single area of the brain that is dysfunctional. But neuroscience has moved on, and now we think about networks. We think about the interactions between multiple systems that contribute to a child's learning difficulty. So in math, for example, you need to recognize symbols, you need to link them to quantities, you need your working memory, you need your attention, and all of these things need to work in concert. So it's very unlikely that you'll find a single neural deficit to this. The other issue with when you look at neuroscientific data and when somebody enthusiastically shares with you brain imaging data, you need to ask, well, how early do you see those difficulties? Because you have to remember that the brain is a highly plastic organ that adapts itself to the environment. So if you're talking about neural deficits, you need to ask, are they the cause or the consequence? So what I mean by that is you could imagine that, you know, a child is born with some kind of brain difficulty, and that leads them to have later on calculation difficulties. But it's also possible that children who do not have the same environments, who do not have the same quality of instruction, look like they have a brain difficulty, but it's just for lack of input. So their brain hasn't been able to construct representations in the same way as other children. So brain imaging data is always correlational, so ask about is it the cause or the consequence. And the sample sizes tend to be small, as this figure illustrates. These are all the imaging studies that we could find. And you can see that the sample sizes are always below 20. And again, variable inclusion criteria. So there's a lot of mess in the neuroscience literature around developmental dyscalculia. And just yesterday, we actually published a paper in Human Brain Mapping together with my colleagues in Singapore, where we report the largest to date neuroimaging study of developmental dyscalculia. And what we found was that we actually couldn't detect any brain differences between children with and without developmental dyscalculia on tests of visuospatial working memory, on tests of magnitude processing, and on tests of arithmetic. However, these children all look dyscalculic on their behavioral measures. This tells us that our brain imaging methods aren't sophisticated enough yet to get at that, because there needs to be some kind of biological precursor to developmental dyscalculia, but we're not at the point yet. So if somebody's over-enthusiastic about neuroimaging, tell them to put the brakes on a little bit. We can gain a lot more from observing children, from working with children, than we can get from putting them into imaging machines, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't do neuroscience of learning difficulties, but we shouldn't assume that it's super powerful, because it's very noisy. Briefly want to talk about genetics, because I think this is really important, just conceptually speaking. We used to think that we can find a gene for X. When I was a master's student, I was working in a genetics lab, and literally they were looking for the gene for schizophrenia. They were convinced that they could find a single genetic variant that would tell us whether somebody has schizophrenia or not. And there's a long history of hunting for these single genes. But that's based on relatively small sample sizes. So this is what happens when we're now in the age of genomics, right? You remember in the 2000s, the human genome was sequenced? Well, now we can, it took them years. Now we can do it in minutes. And so what geneticists are finding now is that when you look at complex things such as BMI, height, if you look at how many genes are associated with them, well, if you've got 1 million people, you find that there's over 2,500 different genetic loci that are associated with something like BMI or height. And the same goes for many complex conditions such as schizophrenia, diabetes. The take-home message is there are no single genes. There are multiple genes for each condition that we might experience, including learning difficulties, that contribute to the outcome. So looking for single genes is just not there. This is a paper just published 2 years ago, actually last year, the first big paper on dyslexia, 42 genes. That's an underestimate. That's because they don't yet have large sample sizes. They're going to find at least 200-300, if not thousands, of genetic variants associated with dyslexia. And guess what? When you look at the biological downstream effects of these genes, when you ask what do they actually functionally do when they become proteins, well, guess what? They're involved in building the brain. That's what they're involved with. So that also helps us to understand why we might have multiple disorders within the same child, because it is the genes that are involved in brain development, in sculpting their neuronal pathways that are different in these children. And this has led to the articulation of what's called the fourth law of behavioral genetics, which states that a typical human behavioral trait, such as mathematics, is associated with many genetic variants, each of which accounts for a small percentage of the behavioral variance. So we have many genes, not one single gene. So to summarize, from genetic, cognitive traits are associated with many genetic variants. The same genes correlate with multiple cognitive traits. So you have what's called a high genetic overlap between reading and math, which might help us to understand why these disorders frequently co-occur. And I will bet you a lot of money that there will never be the discovery of a dyscalculia gene. It is highly unlikely. Of course, we need to acknowledge that there are single gene disorders, right? Huntington's disease, Fragile X, that's single genes. We also know that there are disorders that are driven by genetic mutations. However, in the case of something like math learning difficulties, I find it really hard to see that being true. I think it is more likely that we'll understand that it's multiple genes, each of which have a small effect on the overall presentation. So, just to conclude on dyscalculia, and then if I have 2-3 minutes left, how much is that? 7 minutes, perfect. Then I'll talk a little bit about math anxiety. Just there's a couple of points I would like to make on math anxiety. So just to conclude, the most important take home that I want you to have from today's session is dyscalculia exists and represents a significant challenge for those who are affected by it. I have seen many children who have got persistent math difficulties. These are not children that are stupid. These are not children that are dumb. They have these difficulties, and we of course need to attend to that. But at the same time, while we know a lot about developmental dyscalculia, there's a lot that we do not know. We need more research with larger samples. There is no one single deficit. It is likely that there's multiple subtypes of developmental dyscalculia. And the brain imaging evidence to date is very unclear. So if anybody wants to sell you that there is, a neuroscience of dyscalculia that's going to solve your problems in your classrooms, do not believe them. Briefly talk about math anxiety, because the main take home here I want to have, and I want to leave time for questions, is just that math anxiety, like dyscalculia, exists and is real, but it's not the same thing as developmental dyscalculia. Very important. Mathematics anxiety is a real thing. This is a quote from a student with math anxiety. Math exams terrify me. My palms get sweaty, I breathe too fast, and I can't read this anymore. I've got reading anxiety because of the teleprompter. But basically, the quote essentially says that there's sort of a number of components to that child's experience. One of them is deeply physiological, right? We all know what deep anxiety feels like to us. It's that pit in our stomach, right? That physiological reaction that we feel when we're anxious. So there's the physiological reaction. The student also, beneath the captions, talks about being sweaty, but then talks about the social dimensions, looking around and feeling like they're the only one who can't do it. I think this is an experience that most of us as human beings have had, but imagine having this every day in your classroom. And so there's social isolation, there's physiological reaction, and there's sort of also the preoccupation with the anxiety, right? You're just continually ruminating about the fact that that you can't do it. And that takes a lot of energy, right? To constantly be dealing with those feelings and to at the same time pretend that you're cool, right? Because you don't want to give away that you might have difficulties in math. And this is extremely common. So this is data from the OECD PISA study, which includes the United States and many other countries, millions of students. Lots of them say they have negative emotions towards math. And math anxiety is on the rise. This is between 2003 and 2012. It's probably even worse now, where you can see that on average math anxiety is increasing, though in some countries it's decreasing. So it's not as though this is a universal finding, but on average math anxiety is on the rise. So I would say that students' attitudes and emotions need to be taken into account in a subject like mathematics as well. We tend to look at mathematics as it's a very cold subject, it's a rule-based, governed, but the learners may not feel about it that way. Math anxiety affects performance, and a fear for math anxiety is prevalent. I just want to close by addressing this question, because this question I feel is an important one. Is math anxiety the same thing as having a math learning difficulty? This was addressed again by the same group from the University of Cambridge in a large study with 1,500 children. What I'm going to show you here is a very ugly figure, but it's an important one. On the horizontal axis, you've got math anxiety. So the further you are towards the right-hand side, the more math anxious you are. On the horizontal axis, I've got math performance. So it's essentially showing you the relationship between math performance and math anxiety. What you can see here, there's not much of a there, right? It's not a very strong relationship. You can see on average, yeah, students who have high math anxiety have low math performance. But it's not like a whopping big correlation. It's a correlation of about 0.3, 0.2, 0.3. Then I want you to just pay attention to the black dots. These are students who were below the 10th percentile on the standardized test of mathematics. So essentially they're dyscalculic. They are all over the place when it comes to math anxiety. And so I think the take home from this is that we must not assume that when we encounter a student who has a strong emotional reaction towards math, that they are necessarily not capable of learning the math, but rather that their emotional difficulties and their math anxiety is holding them back from something they could actually achieve and something that we can release them from. And so I think we need to be, and this is the final thing I'll say, we need to be aware that math learning difficulties and emotional reactions towards math are not the same thing, and let's not judge students who have math anxiety and assume that they are, you're just not a math person. That's not the case, right? That's what these data clearly show. And in general, I think we need to be open about the fact that math anxiety exists. By the way, it also exists amongst parents, amongst educators, probably amongst grandparents. And this whole ecosystem of anxiety around math is rubbing off onto students. So we all need to be aware of our math anxiety, but let's not confuse math anxiety with developmental dyscalculia. And with that, I will leave all of this for another time. And thank you very much for your attention.